Well, hello there, my witchy friends. How are things? I hope you're well. I hope things are going well for you. And if not, I pray they will be looking up for you very soon. I'm Sage, for those who are new here, and this is a new lesson of the Wiccan Way Grove. Now, if this is the first lesson of ours you've stumbled across, and you want to study with the Grove, I encourage you to go back to the first lesson and do them in order. And if you're 18 or older, we welcome anybody who can be respectful and cordial in a forum to come visit the Grove's Facebook page and join us. We have assignments, we have discussions, we have recommendations for supplemental materials. We have chats. We just change things around, but we may start having meditations and other events pretty soon, so we're working it out. Those who complete the Outer Grove coursework might be invited to join the Inner Grove, which it's a group for those serious students who get to a certain point and who are ready to work with a smaller group. You'll be assigned a mentor. They'll work with you more closely, and we'll dive into more advanced materials. It doesn't cost anything to join Grove. The only time we've ever had money exchange hands is when we all wanted to do something that cost money. Like when I used to teach Grove in real life, everybody chip in for candles and incense for the rituals. And online, sometimes we've had fun and games with prizes, and everybody chips in for the prizes. Or we've used software, such as meeting software. We don't use it anymore, but the one we used to use, because we were having no luck with the free platforms, cost over $600 a year. So there were a bunch of us, and we all chipped in about 20-25 bucks or whatever anybody could afford. And that's the only time there's ever money exchanging hands. And right now we don't have anything like that because we're just using Facebook and YouTube. So it's not a business. It's not even a nonprofit organization. It's just an informal teaching / learning circle of friends and volunteers. If you're interested, check it out. It's in the link below in the description box. But if you prefer, you can just follow these lessons and do self-study. That's fine too. Today we're going to talk about paganism, witchcraft, and Wicca. What exactly is the difference? What's the difference between witchcraft and Wicca? What's the difference between an eclectic Wiccan or an eclectic Neopagan? Well, there are definitely differences, and there are definitely overlaps. So let's take a look at them. Starting with paganism. The term pagan is originally from the Latin paganus, which basically meant someone from a rural area or a village, country dweller. It also meant civilian, and eventually it started getting used as a slur. Calling someone a pagan back then was kind of like calling them a country bumpkin or a redneck or a hillbilly, or that would be the modern day equivalent. In medieval times, the term became even more of a slur, and a dangerous one, as Christians began using the term to refer to the people who worshipped what they believed were false gods. And it would also be used because non-Christians were considered civilians, while Christians were soldiers of Christ. We don't use the term in that way anymore, though. But basically, pagan has since referred to worshippers of non-Abrahamic religions or nature-based spiritualities. So if you weren't Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, you were considered pagan. We don't use that as broadly anymore. Atheists certainly don't consider themselves pagans. Hindus, even though they worship non-Abrahamic gods, don't consider themselves pagans. At least not Eastern Hindus. Some people in the West who do practice Hinduism consider it a pagan religion, so it depends on your perspective even. The current dictionary definition of paganism is a person who is a member of a religious, spiritual, or cultural community based on the worship of nature or the earth, a neopagan. That's according to dictionary.com. Pagan is also listed as an irreligious or hedonistic person, or person who is uncivilized or unenlightened. It's just one of those words that has many meanings going way back, and some of those meanings are neutral, others aren't exactly flattering. Obviously, modern pagans have embraced the term to mean nature-based spirituality or honoring the old gods, and we view it in a more positive light, seeing nothing wrong with worshiping nature or different gods. So I wouldn't worry about it or get offended. Words evolve, and it takes time, and old meanings don't usually just break off and fall away like that. But it should be known that paganism isn't a religion in itself. And pagans don't all believe the same thing or practice the same things. About the only thing pagan religions really have in common is that they're non-Abrahamic. Pagan's an umbrella term that many different religions and spiritual paths fall under. We've already talked about how there are ancient pagans or paleo-pagans who are like the Celts, the Aborigines, the Egyptians. Then there are the Meso-pagans, which was basically paganism as it evolved and changed after the spread of Abrahamic religions in their intermingling mainly with Christianity. And then there are the Neopagans, the modern era of paganism. The pagan revival of the 20th century, the Reconstructionists, the Reinventionists. Wicca falls into the latter group. So if you look at a diagram, pagan would be a big circle. A lot of different religions would either be smack dab in the circle or kind of hanging off the edge because there may be paganism blended with something else. Wicca would be one of the religions inside that circle. So Wicca would be a circle in the pagan circle. Wicca is one pagan religion of many, but not the only one. The thing about pagan religions is that we do tend to see ourselves as a greater community, which is beautiful. Though we can't automatically assume we all think and believe the same things, there are still a lot of overlaps between our different faiths. And though there has been some interbickering among different groups, because, hey, where there are humans, there is bickering. But by and large, there's been mutual respect among pagans with regards to our differences. So if you are Wiccan, you are pagan and may consider yourself part of the greater pagan community. So what about witches? The thing with the word witch is that, like pagan, it is very ancient and has a lot of different meanings. And how we define it today in the pagan community is often very different than how it's defined in the past or how non-pagans might define it. There's a myth going around that we pagans have reclaimed the word witch. That witches were the wise ones who went around usually protecting the crops or healing the villagers and such, until Christianity came along and accused witches of evil because they didn't like witches having more power and prestige than their Christian priests. So they started the burning times and spread bad rumors about us and drove remaining witches underground to practice in secret for centuries. None of that is accurate, actually. Those theories from the late 19th, early 20th century have been debunked. The word witch historically specifically referred to people who used malevolent magic. In the Old English form W-I-C-C-E for the feminine or W-I-C-C-A for the masculine, that is where Gerald Gardner got the word from. The CC in Old English, by the way, was pronounced ch, so witcha. That was used to describe malevolent magic users. So, Gardner used the word witch, and a lot of revivalists used the word witch, but it doesn't mean that the use of the word was always like that. Kind of like in the 80s, there was a rock band called Iron Maiden. Doesn't mean that when you see the word Iron Maiden, or the words Iron Maiden in medieval literature, that it was referring to 80s pop metal music. It was a torture device back then, and then the band had the same name. So it's the same with witch. It had a meaning a long time ago. It was associated with bad things. People started using the word differently, and they redefined it in more recent times, but that doesn't change the way they used it way back over 1,000 years ago. And the word witch, even as it translated into other languages, referred to malevolent magic users. I know a lot of people will point out in the Bible that the original Hebrew of the passage, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," translates to poisoner. So there have been people arguing that Christians changed that to witch because they wanted to attack witches. In reality, if you talk to somebody who has studied ancient Hebrew, they'll tell you that to the ancient Hebrews, poisoner and witch were the same thing, because malevolent witches used herbs and stuff to hurt people. So it's like a matter of semantics there. No one would call themselves a witch back then. You'd be crazy, because it'd basically be some kind of admission of evil. It'd be like an open invitation for persecution. Pagans persecuted those accused of witchcrafts just as bad, if not worse, than Christians. Just wasn't as organized a persecution effort. But that's basically because we're talking about what they associated with malevolent magic. Now, there were people who used benevolent magic. There have always been benevolent magic users in every time, in every culture, in just about every religion. But they would not have used the word witch to describe themselves. They would have identified with a different term, and probably something more local, because witchcraft was synonymous with malevolence. Using magic in any way in ancient times wasn't considered a religion in itself, though. It was a practice some would study, or it would be handed down through the family. People would practice their indigenous religion, whatever was their local religion, they would practice, and they would use magic. And they would, of course, tie certain religious beliefs and practices into that magical practice. But doing magic wasn't a religion. It wasn't witchcraft. Witchcraft was not a religion back then. Witchcraft was people who did malevolent magic. Now, the first people to come up with the idea that witches were practicing some kind of religion is, ironically, Christians. They believed witchcraft was essentially a devil-worshipping religion. And pagans never thought of witchcraft as a religion in and of itself. It was just the people doing bad magic. So anyone accused of witchcraft were being persecuted. There were still benevolent people, people practicing benevolent magic at that time, but they kept a low profile, especially if they weren't Christian or didn't appear Christian enough, because they wanted to avoid persecution. Again, magic wasn't their religion, though, so many of the indigenous cultures and pagan societies began converting to Christianity. They simply adapted their magic to their new Christian ways. Nothing went underground in this big, deceptive hiding out. Then there was the rise of ceremonial magicians, the occultists. They practiced high magic. High magic had pagan undertones, but it was steeped in Judeo-Christian mysticism. It was for the learned people, so usually men, and usually those of wealth and influence, because high-class men were among the few who had the luxury of not having to do hard labor to survive, and they were able to afford books, and they were able to afford education, and they were actually literate and could learn math and astrology, and they were able to devote themselves to study, and they could buy the fancy tools and afford the fancy temples. High magic was in working with otherworldly beings like angels and demons in attempt to gain knowledge or do the magician's bidding. And because they were largely upper class men, and a lot of their concepts were bent towards Judeo-Christian beliefs and scriptures, they were better able to get away with it than, say, a poor cunning folk, or healer, or curanderos, or whatever you want to say the local word was for the benevolent magic users. Now, the benevolent magic users, they were among the peasants. They were usually poor and uneducated and hardworking, and they'd be feared and revered by the locals at the same time. The churches didn't really appreciate them for that. They practiced low magic being folk magic, more nature-based magic, and these low magic traditions had been passed down through the ages in their families or from teacher to student. And even though much of it had been Christianized, the pagan roots were still much more recognizable because they'd been passed down from antiquity. These men and women had much simpler rites, more personalized, often used very simple everyday items, often domestic items. It wasn't until the late 19th or the early 20th century that the word witch started getting redefined to mean good or bad magic users. And mainly due to, frankly, poor scholarship and a trend in romanticizing ancient pagan and magic, ancient paganism and magic. That's where the old religion theories started to develop. The word witch started getting redefined in the late 19th to the early 20th century, mainly due to what was frankly poor scholarship and a trend towards romanticizing ancient paganism and magic. Those theories have been entirely debunked, and people just began redefining witchcraft so it no longer referred specifically to malevolent magic users. And then we have Gardner, who bought into the old religion theories and perpetuated them as he tried to reconstruct this old religion that he thought he'd found. The result was his coven, British traditional witchcraft tradition, or the original trads of what is now known as Wicca today. And Gardner decided that you needed to be initiated through his lineage and taught in his coven in order to be a quote-unquote real witch. And that didn't sit very well with other people practicing magic who were beginning to embrace the newly defined concept of witch. Screw Gardner, basically, because we have our own ideas. And you could say some of these people had even more claim to the word than Gardner, because some of them did learn in their family traditions that have been passed down through the ages. So there were many non-Gardner style witches, and Gardner's witches weren't certainly happy about that. There were some witch wars over who had more rights to use the word, and frankly Gardner lost, which is why the term British traditional witchcraft, or Wicca, has become more common to use for the religions that he started other than just witchcraft. Witchcraft is a much broader word that not only includes all various kinds of witchcraft, both pagan and non-pagan, Wiccan and non-Wiccan, but also the fantasy style of, books and stories and movies. Now, I don't want to rehash what we've already learned. In the first lesson, I went over basic definitions of Wicca. So, just to recap, Wicca is a modern pagan fertility religion, and it can be divided into two basic categories: the traditionalists, those trained in covens with proper lineage that can be traced back to Gardner; British traditional witchcraft, The other category would be the eclectic, those who learn from out-of-court materials or non-lineage traditions based on both Gardner's writings and other sources. And sometimes this is referred to as Neo-Wiccan, though again, to me that's always so redundant since all of Wicca is pretty neo. As I've said, Grove teaches eclectic Wicca, and we make no claims of lineage or initiation. Wiccans do often practice witchcraft, though in the last 20 years or so, not always. There are a lot of witches of different religions and beliefs who are not Wiccan, so it's not always a given that they're interchangeable. Wicca was very influential in the pagan revival and in the witchcraft explosion of the 20th century, so you often see that influence in any books or websites or practices, but there are many witches who simply don't identify as Wiccan religiously. Modern witches aren't even all religious or all pagan, so that should be kept in mind. If we look at that Venn graph again, Wicca is inside the pagan circle, and witchcraft overlaps. Wicca overlaps the pagan circle, but also exists outside of it. So a Wiccan is a pagan and often a witch. A pagan may be a Wiccan or some other pagan religion. They may or may not be a practitioner of witchcraft. Witches may not be a Wiccan witch, or maybe some other kind of pagan witch, or maybe they're not any kind of pagan at all. There are atheist witches, there are Christian witches, there are witches of different religions. Wicca is actually a pretty unique religion from run-of-the-mill generic Neopaganism or generic witchcraft. It has pagan influences naturally from different pagan religions. It's also highly influenced by ceremonial magic. Gardner was a ceremonial magician before founding Wicca. Wicca tends to be a blend of ceremonial and witchcraft, both high and low magic. We do often respect many occult and esoteric writings and teachings. Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, etc. They were all influences of Wicca. Wicca is also borrowed from Eastern philosophies. Gardner lived for a few years in the Far East, and he was very influenced by those types of religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. It also is influenced by nature religions, nature reverence, modern thought, of course, because it's a modern religion. And of course, the now defunct witch culture theories. Though the theories have no real basis in history, some of the things they taught that ancient witches did have been kind of embraced by Wiccans and adapted, and they work for us, so why not, right? That should really be a spiritual path's goal, not age, but whether or not it's working for the people now, and is it helping people in their spiritual path as they practice it now. Wicca was deliberately developed, and it's still growing and evolving, so it tends to adapt easily to the modern world. We don't see Gardner as a prophet, but as a founder. So just because something is not what Gardner had in mind doesn't necessarily mean it can't find its way into Wicca. Okay, so I think that about does it for today. I hope that sheds some light, and as is always true with Grove, we don't expect everyone to be Wiccan. You don't have to dedicate yourself to Wicca to be in the Grove. You might be a different kind of pagan or a non-Wiccan witch, and that's fine. We teach through a Wiccan lens, so you'll have to understand that. But the lessons can benefit anyone really of any earth-based spirituality or magical path. What you do with the information beyond that is up to you. So please remember to like us, share, subscribe if you haven't, ring the bell so you get the updates when we put out new lessons, and if you do one thing, please comment, because YouTube algorithms love comments and it helps me with my channel so I can keep producing content for the Grove and for everybody else. Thank you very much for listening. Have a magical day.